Howdy, howdy. Welcome back to my tiny corner of the internet. And so in today's video, I kind of want to share a story with you. It's because I was chatting with my boss, and my boss is, of course, bourgeois. I don't hide that fact. The fact is, he's a mixed bag, okay? I've talked a lot about that he's basically a word cell. He plays power politics a lot with people. In fact, a project that got thrown on my lap was thrown on my lap exclusively because the fact is, he couldn't stop playing petty power politics with another engineer. And so he walked off the team and transferred to another team. And that's how this project got tossed on my lap. And, he still hasn't really learned his lesson about the replaceability of engineers, about how they're not as replaceable as they would like to believe. So, with that being said, I was chatting with him the other day. It was probably about a week ago when we started talking about the cost of living crisis, yada, yada, yada. And, on top of that, he was complaining about Mom Donnie winning in New York. And obviously, I'm not the one to talk about politics at work, is because that's incredibly unprofessional. That's not my job to talk about politics at work, right? When you hire me to do a job, I go there to do a job, not necessarily to talk about politics. I'm not being paid to talk about politics. I'm being paid to build things, okay? And so that's my mentality. So he starts talking to me about Mom Donnie, and the policies where they're going to tax the rich. And I'm just kind of rolling my eyes because I'm not, me. On this channel, I'm not the biggest fan of CEOs. Like, I am very selective of billionaires, okay? I can praise Gabe Newell and be like, okay, he has contributed good value to humanity with the products he creates. He's basically trying to make Linux a popular operating system that's an alternative to Microsoft Windows, which just constantly spies on you, right? And then there's billionaires like Larry Fink, Bill Gates, and, these billionaires, in a sort of sense, have a twisted, self-sense of worth, right? Larry Fink is quite literally the new head of the World Economic Forum, and BlackRock is quite literally making the vast majority of Americans in the upcoming generation perpetual renters in their own homelands, aliens in their own homeland. So, the thing is not all billionaires are equal. So he goes on a rant talking about if you just basically pass taxes, and you just basically tax the wealthy, that's just going to push the wealthy to leave, and they're just going to leave the state, and yada, yada, yada. We've heard the story. If you've ever criticized wealthy people, and you talk about passing taxes on wealthy people, the big talking point is the rich people are just going to leave, okay? And so the funny part is, I began to think about that in that particular moment, and it kind of made me realize, if all billionaires are not created equal, because everyone was fear-mongering about billionaires leaving, New York State and coming down to the South, where I'm from, after they're passing these property taxes. And I thought, wait a minute, I don't want rich New Yorkers coming to my state and buying up the land that RVs sit on to rent them out for like $500 a month and, contributing it, right? That's when I realized, the whole taxing the billionaires, oh, they're going to leave if you tax them mentality. It's like, that's not even a threat anymore. Because the fact is that, there is an idea of what it meant to be an entrepreneur and a capitalist in the United States that is quickly eroding in the favor of rent-seeking parasitism. I've talked about it on this channel a couple of times, but the fact is that the reason that used to be a threat is that if you raise taxes on the billionaires, that they're going to leave and go do business somewhere else, is because the fact is there was an axiomatic assumption that a billionaire would bring value to civilization just by existing within that society. Like, oh, Gabe Newell, he creates, a competitive gaming platform like Steam that's incredibly friendly and consumer-friendly and good to the consumer. Obviously, I would be upset if somebody like that left my state to go to another one, is because the taxes are too high. And that's when I realized is that this non-equivalency between billionaires and just the overall degradation of what entrepreneurship means in the United States has become almost colloquial to rent-seeking parasitism. Is because the fact is, as I was telling my boss, and it's like, well, if they pass property taxes and Larry Fink and BlackRock were forced to leave my state, I wouldn't cry about that. I'd probably grab a pitchfork and a torch myself and run them out myself. I don't want Larry Fink buying up all the properties in my state and making, myself and everybody else perpetual renters while they just completely decline the standard of living just so they can extract more rent-seeking, parasitism. I don't want these people in my state. And that's what I realized, okay? Is because the fact is that not all billionaires are equal. And the fact is that this is becoming more readily apparent that, people aren't saying it either way, is because the fact is, as soon as American society crosses the threshold where billionaires, taxing billionaires, is going to make them to leave is no longer a negative outcome, but a good thing. You as the ruling class should be deeply worried, is because the fact is, what value to civilization are you bringing? Okay? And so my boss was talking about, he goes on the whole purchasing power gaslights argument, because I talk about, most people don't like BlackRock because they're buying up all these homes and they're making people perpetual renters, Blackstone, Vanguard, American Homes for Rent. And he says, people, he goes on a long rant, and of course I have to be polite, is because he's my boss and that yada, yada, yada. He was like, well, people like to complain about the cost of living. It's so popular these days, but, you know, think of, like, you know, in the third world where there's, like, African kids, you know, dying of leukemia and having their balls chewed off by a tiger, right? You know, they'll go on this hyperbolic rant to say, like, well, there's starving African children, so you should be thankful for what you got. No matter whether or not the person saying this has multiple rental properties, it's always coming from a boomer who owns multiple properties with a fully paid off mortgage on each of them that's charging $3,000 a month on their rentals, right? And then demanding young people pay into Social Security by working 2 jobs, right? You know, they'll ignore that aspect, that they were able to afford their own homes. Just like my coworker who's an elder millennial who's 37. You know, he can play the gaslight games about the cost of living and just working hard and all that sort of stuff, but he'll never tell you, unless you really prod him on it, is that he's never rented an apartment in his life. And the one time he did it. One time he did rent, he rented a house for 6 months alone by itself, right? But he's more than willing to prod the younger generations and gaslight them over the cost of living crisis, even though, like, early Gen Z, you know, graduates who are in their early 20s or mid 20s, right? You know, they're probably never going to own their own home in their entire lives, and they've done nothing but consecutively rent. And on top of that, I've rented for the vast majority of my early 20s. So the fact is like, you have this generational divide, okay, of a staple that used to be a part of the American standard of living, the Pax Americana, the golden era of American civilization, where you owned your own home, and off of a single income, you could own a car, and provide for your family. You know, this was the deal. This was the negotiation. And it's incredibly insulting to hear that gaslight. Okay, and he goes on the purchasing power gaslights. He says, think of the starving African children, you know, is because they have it so much worse, while pretending the fact and ignoring the fact that most people who are criticizing the cost of living crisis just simply want the same standard of living of their parents without being gaslit over it. So, you know, I point this out. I was like, most people understand that. You know, we're aware that the third world countries are out there, and that they have a pretty terrible standard of living. But the fact is most people are not arguing for that when they're talking about the cost of living crisis. They're talking about the 1970s standard of living. And I was like, that's the main thing. I told him this. I told him that's what most people are, you know, saying that. So then he doubles down on the third worldist argument, if I can remember correctly, to basically say, you know, think of the starving African children is because the fact is, it's like, you know, third worlders, and that's the reason why you should just kind of accept your declining standard of living. And he's even talked about it. You know, about, you know, the whole, like, home ownership thing going away in the future, and everybody's going to be renting, and almost tacitly, like, you know, enabled it. It's almost like a sadistic joy for him, which I'm not surprised from. I'm not a big fan of this jackass, is because it's your typical boomer pull the ladder mentality of like, oh, I'm going to pull the ladder now that I've got my, like, 5 rental properties. I couldn't care less whether or not everybody else is getting screwed, you know. So he's doing this kind of nonsense. And so I was like, well, you know, if you're going to basically pull the ladder on it, when he starts going on this spiel about, like, saying it doesn't matter, it's like, how can you get upset at people who are all of a sudden wanting to tax billionaires when they're quite literally trying to make an entire generation of people perpetual renters in their own country? And, you know, the funny part, he's like, well, it doesn't matter. He goes on it like, you know, it's always it doesn't matter. It's just not the same thing. You know, if you've ever had that argument, it's just not the same. Okay. You know, it's all the gaslights I've talked about on this channel, from you know, saying that to get the same standard of living as your parents, you should just work hard, right? Which we know that's a gaslight. To moving the goalpost and saying, well, that standard of living either never existed, which is another gaslight that they do about it, or say that it was an exception that's never going to return, while they dictate the terms and conditions for the new standard of living that they want you to accept without protest. And they'll do a million gaslights saying this is what younger generations want. Like, younger generations want to rent, not own their own homes. Even though I can look in my own comment section, and the vast majority of Americans want to own their own home. And I said straight up, because I told him, I was like, okay, so you can't be surprised if people are adopting pro-socialist policies, is because the fact is they see a class of people quite literally making them aliens in their own homeland. Like, what loss is it if they raise taxes and, like, Larry Fink leaves, you know, California or New York, right? And I'm not a big fan of California, New York. I don't like them either. I don't want rich New Yorkers or Californians coming to my state and then driving up property prices. But that's neither here nor there. So I tell him this, and it said, not all billionaires are created equal. And that's kind of the funny part, because I told him straight up, I was like, I talked about Gabe Newell, and I said, you know, he's done great things for humanity. He's made great products. He has a consumer base that is quite loyal to him, is because he focuses on consumer friendliness and making overall a good quality product for his base, as opposed to Larry Fink, who's just speculatively trading property values up and then, you know, talking about making everybody perpetual renters in their own homeland. And then you have Larry Ellison doing all these spy programs, talking about digital ID and how AI is going to make them everybody on their best behavior. But it's funny enough, never the ruling class that's ever acting on their behavior, and none of them get thrown in jail. But that's neither here nor there. And he said, it doesn't matter. because, you know, yada, yada, yada. It's like, you know, these people are existing independently of you. You chose to rent from a landlord that had these sorts of things. I was like, I pointed out, I was like, nobody chose the average house price to be $500,000, okay? And I said, you know, you're talking about it's a negative thing, pushing out billionaires out of American society if we just tax them and they're just going to leave the state. You know, you do realize, like, that was only a threat. When, you know, you have people like Gabe Newell who are actually doing good things for civilization. You know, people who actually build things, the entrepreneur, the tinkerer in his garage, right? Now that the average person can't even own their own garage to be a tinkerer in the first place, because if they were, you know, to do, you know, build things in their garage, you know, then they were, the land management team would probably get mad at that. You'd be damaging the property or some stuff. You're not allowed to experiment or, you know, use solder boards is because that's a fire hazard and that's a heat source, yada, 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 right? And so the fact is that, like, you know, if that type of member of the ruling class is no longer there, who's going to protest passing higher higher taxes on the wealthy if they know that that's just going to push them out? Like, is anybody going to complain that Larry Fink left the United States is because property tax is too high? Be real with me. He says, well, it doesn't matter. You can always do things independently of them. No, because you've cornered the market. And I told him, you've cornered the market to drive up property values so that it's unaffordable to the vast majority of ordinary Americans. And he says, well, that's just a pretty radical way of doing things. And I told him flat out, I was like, if it were up to me, and this is a hot take, and I don't really care, it's because I don't hide my politics to anybody, is if it were up to me, I would quite literally nationalize BlackRock, seize their assets, do a fat fire sale of their assets, including their home, back to the American people for pennies on the dollar, and I'd throw Larry Fink in jail. Okay? I told him that straight to his face, and he looked at me, he's like, well, that's sounding a bit communistic and socialistic. I was like, I don't care. I don't hate all billionaires equally. Some billionaires do good things for American civilization, but stop pretending that Larry Fink is an equivalency to people who actually produce value for human civilization. You're not giving anybody any benefit to wanting to keep billionaires in their society when all they're doing is buying up properties and then driving up prices and making people aliens in their own homeland, okay? You know why people are turning economically left, and you know why they're going to continue turning economically left, is because all you've done is lie and gaslight and deceive about the cost of living crisis. And the people who do protest it, Pam Bondi's talking about putting them on extremist lists, you know, to basically keep track of them, okay? So the fact is, you know why people are protesting these things. You're not actually acknowledging what people actually care about, namely the cost of living crisis, and so thus, they're having to talk about it, and you're trying to silence them. Okay? Now, like I said earlier, okay, you know, I told him straight up, yeah, I have no problem throwing Larry Fink in jail. My boss calls me a communist. I couldn't give less of a shit. Okay? And I've even said multiple times on this channel that I don't care about the ideals of communism. I don't care about the ideology of communism. I don't care about the over-socialized nature of love. I just want an affordable standard of living for ordinary American workers in this country so they can, you know, A, off of a single income, own their own home, and be able to raise a family. That is my metric for what I consider to be a good economy for the average American worker, provided they don't do drugs, they're not degenerates, they're not alcoholics, and they stay clean and they work hard. That is my terms and conditions on what I would say it should be the baseline for the American worker and American civilization. And the funny part is the politics I'm talking about is no different than it was, you know, in the 1890s or the previous Gilded Age. It's because the United States is entering into a second Gilded Age and we're pretending and gaslighting younger generation. So that's kind of the funny part. I've talked about it previously on this channel about how boomers like to gaslight and pretend that they are the silent generation, when in fact the current generation is now millennials and onwards, late millennials, early millennials probably do own their homes, have more in common with the silent generation, minus the world wars, than boomers actually do. But boomers love to pretend to be this generation. And I always tell boomers, you're not that guy. Okay? So that's kind of the thing. When it comes to younger generations, they share more in common with the silent generation, given the circumstances of living through a second Gilded Age. The only difference between us and the generation that was living in that period is that we have an entire generation of people who quite literally lived through the golden era of Pax Americana that is persistently gaslighting us, insulting us, and browbeating us over the existing standard of living that they had, and then telling us that we should just simply work harder to get the same prosperity that they had, even though they actively pull the ladder to prevent us from ever having that prosperity. So that was the one thing I realized, you know, fairly recently when I had that discussion with my boss, because I realized it's like, you know, it used to be an actual argument from libertarians that, you know, if you tax billionaires, that they're going to leave. And that sounds like a terrible thing. It's like, oh, the people who are producing so much value for civilization are going to leave. But the thing is that, does that mean we're pushing out Gabe Newell or Larry Fink? Because I like Gabe Newell. He's a cool guy. He's making a quality product and actually makes quality, you know, products for human civilization. Larry Fink just speculatively asset trades and then pretends he's doing hard work. Okay, so they're not equal. As soon as the majority of the ruling class become Larry Finks instead of Gabe Newells, you know, you're in trouble. Okay, because then everybody who has been alienated from their own country and made to be a renter in their own homeland is going to reject this premise. They're going to reject this deal, okay? And it doesn't matter how hard you try and shove it down people's throats, right? You know, they have no incentive to preserve the existing structure, and that should frighten you. I've talked about this a couple of times in my previous videos. So that is my message to the ruling class, is that if you try and play if you try to play the game where you try to use the arm of the state to shut down dissidency for people who simply just want to have an affordable standard of living in their own homeland, it will backfire. That is my prophecy to the ruling class. With that being said, a bit of a spicy video, but I don't want to get this out of the way, is because the fact is I haven't uploaded in 2 weeks. And so I do like to tell people when they come to this channel is that this is not my day job. My day job is professionally being an engineer. I like building things. That has been my passion project since I was young. I love doing what I do. But the thing is, at the end of the day, it's like, you know, I'm just the guy who's giving his 2 cents on the internet. So this is just a side gig. I'm not even monetized. I don't really have an intention to monetize this channel unless there's something seriously happened where I lost my job, and thus I would be forced to monetize my channel. I personally don't care about monetizing my channel. I'm just the guy giving my 2 cents on the internet on what I think is the best way to address the problems that the American working class is facing right now. With that being said, if you liked the video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and I hope to see you around on the channel. Take it easy, y'all.